First of all, good afternoon, everyone. And to our friends in Indonesia, kepada teman-teman dan para hadirin yang berada di Indonesia, selamat datang dan selamat siang. Welcome, everyone, to today's ANU Indonesia event. For those of you who don't know what the Indonesia Institute is, let me just explain a little bit and then I'll explain today's seminar. So the Indonesia Institute is one of several regional institutes here at the College of Asia and the Pacific, and our job is to really bring together all the scholars who are working on Indonesia at the ANU and to act as a sort of hub and to sort of showcase all the work that we do here on Indonesia across a whole range of disciplines, and to connect our scholars here with our friends working on Indonesia around Australia and in Indonesia as well. We hold a whole series of events, but this particular event where we mark International Human Rights Day has become something of a flagship event for us, and we do it each year. And each year we look at a different sort of set of rights or a different sort of human rights issue in Indonesia. And this year, I think it's a really, really timely topic. Dr. Angie Bexley of the ANU has brought together a really outstanding panel to look at some of the sort of pressing issues that are facing young people in Indonesia today. And Indonesia is a very young country. And as we begin to approach the 2024 elections, politicians are always reminding us that Indonesian voters are mostly young voters, and they're always trying to work out what their political preferences are. They're always thinking about how they participate in politics. So it's a really important topic. And I want to really thank Angie for all of her hard work putting this fantastic panel together. So Dr. Angie Bexley is here at the ANU, and she's an expert in youth, in children, in gender, and in poverty. And she's worked on these issues in Indonesia and also in Timor-Leste. And so she's very well placed to be organising this panel today, and we're really, really grateful. So let me hand it over to Angie now, the expert, to introduce the topic and to introduce our wonderful panelists. Thank you very much, Angie.
Thanks so much, Eve. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's Indonesia Institute's International Human Rights Forum. I'd like to begin just quickly by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians on the land on which I live and work and play, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and whose knowledge we must value. I also pay my respects to all First Nations people today joining us. My thanks to the Indonesia Institute for supporting today's event, and for CAP Partnerships for providing their support. So, as Eve said, Indonesia's millennial generation, or broadly understood as those between 25 and 40 years old, constitute a quarter of Indonesia's 276 million total population. Together with Generation Z, which are aged between roughly 12 to 25 years old, they make up over half of Indonesia's total population. So this demographic will shape Indonesia's future, not only in terms of their economic contributions, but their contributions to social, cultural, and political life. Their capacity to contribute to society is also shaped by the extent to which their rights are either fulfilled or curtailed. So the news this week of Indonesia's new criminal code encompasses morality clauses that contravene Indonesia's international law obligations on the right to privacy, but also, and perhaps more significantly, curb freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. The fact that the transition time is 3 years for this new code will not stop selective discrimination against certain groups from increasing paternalistic state that seeks to control access to information and voice. These regressive moves will undoubtedly have disproportionate impacts on young people and minorities. But we're going to step back a little from the developments of this week to look at the bigger picture for young Indonesians today. We have a fabulous lineup of speakers to provide development, policy and academic perspectives on how young people themselves see and experience the world as rights holders, their participation in politics, what they hold as important in democracy, how they currently organise around issues of a right to a clean and sustainable environment, and their right to work. The context in which they can claim these rights is shaped by neoliberalism, the circumstance of the pandemic, and an increasing climate emergency, and what we see now, an increasingly morally conservative parliament. We're going to really get to how young people are negotiating these constraints and the challenges that they face. So our first contribution comes from Widi Laras Sari and Ryan Febrianto from PUSKAPA, which of course is the Centre on Child Protection Wellbeing at Universitas Indonesia. Ryan is a Senior Research Advocacy Associate and Widi is the Head of Research Monitoring and Evaluation. And it's very lovely to welcome PUSKAPA back to ANU for a second time this year. Secondly, we have Arya Fernandes, who is currently the head of the Department of Politics and Social Change at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Arya has conducted national and local surveys of Indonesia public opinion polls since 2009, particularly on the trends and attitudes of young people. And our final contribution comes from Ariane Utomo and Inaya Rakhmani. Ariane is a social demographer at the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Melbourne and is an expert on demographic transitions, marriage, and is currently co-leading a study on millennials in urban Jakarta with Inaya Rakhmani. Inaya is the founding director of the Asia Research Centre at the Universitas Indonesia, and Inaya has written extensively on critical cultural political economy, or the way culture is instrumental in hindering and enabling structural redistribution of wealth and access. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us today. So just quickly on today's session, it will be recorded, it will be uploaded on the New Mandala site later, and we'll post where that will be available. Each presenter will speak for around 20 minutes, and then we're going to be taking questions after all of the presentations. You can write your questions in the Q&A function, and you can also signal, and we can also make you live to voice your question. And as I said, we're going to be addressing all of these at the end. So Widi and Ryan, it's over to you.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, we would like to thank ANU Indonesia Institute for the opportunity. My name is Arya Fernandes, who will be presenting today together with my colleague here, Widi Laras Sari from the Center on Child Protection and Wellbeing at Universitas Indonesia, or PUSKAPA. Our presentation will focus more on sharing our preliminary findings from our latest research on youth engagement in climate and environmental issues in Indonesia. As we are still finalizing our report, hopefully to be published early next year, we are hoping to hear your feedback and suggestions from this presentation. Next, Widi. So yeah, as we all know, the current climate and environmental crisis will affect the lives of future generations. However, it is adults who are making the decisions in terms of preventing and dealing with this crisis, while they are the ones who are less likely to suffer the consequences. Recently, youth worldwide have become more active in acting against climate and environmental crisis. So what about youths in Indonesia? Many publications on climate and environmental crisis have highlighted the role of Indonesian youths in environmental activism, particularly their adoption of more environmentally conscious or environmentally friendly lifestyles. However, their role in advocating for changes in, for example, policy, governance, and practices at the community level has remained under research. Therefore, for us in PUSKAPA, focusing on youth and their participation in shaping relevant action is important. Next, Widi. So the study recognizes that youth engagement is a right that must be protected and supported for it to be meaningful. The study therefore aims to understand this topic more systematically because we as researchers believe that youth engagement is necessary for a more effective response to and mitigation of the impacts of current climate and environmental crisis. So to do this, we designed two research questions to guide our inquiry as per following theory of change. So from this graph, as you can see, the focus of our research is twofold. First, we aim to examine the landscape of youth engagement, particularly looking at characteristics of youth who engage in climate activism, topics that matter to them, pathways of engagement, as well as forms of engagement or what we call as civic action. Second, we try to identify the drivers and barriers of youth engagement. As a result, the study tried to map out the various forms of gaps in activism, challenges, as well as supports that are necessary for youth to build and sustain movements and organizations that are strategic, evidence-based, and effective in delivering Indonesia's agenda in terms of climate and environmental reform. This study was actually conducted through a systematic literature review, focus group discussions, and interviews with a total of 58 key informants, 32 female and 26 male participants, aged 16 to 30 years old, and non-youth practitioners on youth based across the archipelago. The literature review itself screened a total of 771 publications, of which 57 publications were included in the analysis. Next, regarding the study result, I will pass the floor to my colleague, Widi. Widi, over to you.
Thank you. So yeah, the first, we actually mapped the characteristic of youth that actively involved in environment and climate movements. So who are they? So here, so this study, we used the case definition of youth age 16 to 30 following the Indonesian youth law. But when we asked our participants how would they define youth, they actually more open to definition. They often name their peers more as students, young workers, or young activists rather than using age. In terms of gender, our participants also describe the distribution in activism as more mixed and balanced. So we don't have any consensus whether male or female are more dominant. We also note there are some characteristics related to religion and other social identity, for example, like Pemuda Islam or Islamic youth that actually have been working to mitigate the climate and environmental crisis. They actually believe that what they're doing is their religion calling or what their religion taught them to do. We also observed that there are some part of the youth that actually involved in the activism because their idols inspired them to do so. This is the case with BTS Army. So BTS is Korean music group and BTS Army is the name of their fan base. So our participants also describe that the youth that actually active they came from different levels, background, different disciplines of education, as well as profession. They come from various level and sector. But what we note that this profession and education actually can be proxy of skills of age that allow them to access networks and opportunity. So they also mentioned that middle-class urban and Java Islanders predominantly during the conversation, during the discussion that we conducted. Another one is youth that actually have network, resources, skills, and teachability or social capital are those who often seen as actively involved in the movement. And the last is those with lived experience. So our participants observed that youth who were experienced the implication of climate and environmental crisis firsthand. This applies especially for those who live in rural and regional areas. So we also map the topics that matters to youth related to environmental and climate crisis. So what matters to them? Here, these are the topics emerged during our discussion, and we categorize them into these 5 categories. But what we observe that youth activism tends to focus on topics that are close to their lived experience, daily lives, and climate mitigation on small or limited scale. But we also identified several topics that it's not necessarily related to environment or climate crisis, but the youth in our study perceive them as important, such as this injustice toward minority groups, democracy, corruption, gender inequality, religious conflicts and tolerance, entrepreneurship, and reproductive health. And we believe they can inform us the potential entry points to bridge youth to climate and environmental issues. In this study, we also map activities or civic action in which youth are engaged. Here we see that capacity building, which includes awareness raising, training, and education, as well as campaigns such as protests and public engagement are two of the most prominent form of youth civic action. And we also noticed that research and advocacy are the two least activities that were engaged by youth in this study. So we also want to understand the engagement pathway of these youth, how they get into the activism in the first place, how did they get involved. So we found actually at least there are three engagement pathway. First is through youth-led initiative. Second is to civil society organization or environmental non-government organization or ENGO. And the last is through the government. So through the youth-led initiative, what we found that it's not necessarily the youth get into the initiative. They didn't necessarily want to make a great change or make a breakthrough, but they simply want to be in the initiative because of the positive values they offer, such as solidarity, freedom, collaboration of opportunity, safe space for diversity, social networks, and equality. And the second is the pathway through CSO or ENGO. So we found that some of the youth actually know activism from their first contact with CSO or NGO, either through the event that maybe these CSO were organizing, or even the volunteering activities that they were joining, or even becoming the staff members of these CSO or NGOs. And the last is through the government. This one might be very small case, but we want to also show that there are potential entry point through the government. So there was a case where the youth actually get into the government because they wanted to make a change. They want to make a change from the system, from within the system, and change the policy, and want to make change through the bureaucracy. So we also in this study observe the drivers and barriers that support or hamper the youth in doing their activism. So what we observe is that these drivers in different situations can actually become barriers. And we divide them or put them in these 4 categories. So individual factors, social interaction, community, and the last, organizational and policy. So the individual drivers that came up during our study is anxiety about the future impact of climate was something that expressed so many times by our participants. Personal experience, interests, identity, also things that were mentioned and emerged during this study. And for social interaction, being involved in social networks such as friendship, fan-based communities, actually encourage them to participate in the movement. We also noted that they describe their interaction with adults, such as mentors or role models, also incentivize them to pursue activism. Okay. In communities, so inclusive communities that provide them with safe space to develop and express themselves, we found as one of the enabling factors that keep them to committed to their movement in climate and environmental justice. And the last is we also found that enabling environments and policy play a role in safeguarding and strengthening youth participation. Although we also noted that we still have a lack of safe spaces for online and offline. So this is something that we need to maybe work on in the future. So we also noted that youth actually knows the risk different of the civic action. So some topics also emerged during discussion. They discussed the pros and cons of online and offline type of activities. They also been discussing the soft and hard diplomacy, as well as pro and anti-establishment. So the role in social media activists also has been discussed in the literature, and the youth on our study actually recognize this potential. So youth have been using social media for campaigning and managing their activities. They understand actually that the social media activism is not enough to create real change, and they believe that the social media-based effort should be coupled with on-the-ground community building activities. So this time, Ariane will wrap up our study.
Yeah, thank you, Widi. Next, I would like to share you conclusions and recommendations from this study. Yeah, so to conclude, the study highlights 4 key areas that require our attention. First, regarding proportional support in comprehensive civic action so that civic action will not remain in silo. And second, the need to strengthen social capital as it poses as an enabler of civic engagement. And the third, the need to strengthen governance capacity in response to internal challenges within the youth community. And lastly, the importance of addressing tokenistic practices, especially in policymaking or formal participation spaces. Next, Widi. Yeah, so first, regarding proportional support in comprehensive civic action, the study finds that most civic actions are carried out at a community level, and they have therefore not yet managed to achieve systemic change. Stakeholders can work with youths in promoting, for example, various forms of comprehensive youth civic action according to the group's specialization, the scope of issues, and youth capacities. While supporting dominant forms of civic action, as mentioned before by Widi, such as capacity building efforts, campaigns and protests, community assistance, and casework, stakeholders can actually complement youth civic action by facilitating, for example, research and policy advocacy on the same issue. Next, Widi. Yeah, so this study finds that youth civic engagement also are still limited somehow in their ability to reach vulnerable youths. Another challenge is the gap between the existing civic skills, for example, organizational management, critical thinking, or the use of digital technology for activism, and the different needs and conditions of various youths. In this regard, stakeholders can provide safe spaces for participation, as well as adaptive and inclusive support for increasing youth civic skills according to the needs and the characteristics. Some support in terms of, for example, structural factors, such as technological development and the use of creative media can be utilized to fill this gap. Additionally, the study finds limited incentives for youth activists to collaborate with other activists outside their organizations or communities. Meanwhile, their organizational collaborations are essential for the expansion and deepening of their networks, improving knowledge exchange, mobilizing funding prospects, and creating green jobs. So in this regard, stakeholders need to support and encourage forms of collaboration that can expand incentives for youth engagement. Next, the role of social capital. The study finds the social capital is an enabler of civic engagement that can strengthen youth civic commitment and can be useful for reaching out to other group of young people. Stakeholders in this regard can utilize the various existing forms of social capital to expand access and create opportunities for engagement. So we divide them into two categories. The first one is bridging social capital, such as, for example, having the same experience of being affected, being concerned and anxious about climate and environmental issues, as well as binding social capital related to social identities, like student status, indigenous youth, followers of certain religions, beliefs, or fan bases, can actually foster a group solidarity and further unite youths to take civic action on climate and environmental issues. In this regard, stakeholders can promote bridging social capital to expand youth participation. And at the same time, binding social capital can be used as an opportunity to reach out to various identity-based youth groups that have not yet been reached. Next, Widi. And this is our last slide, actually. The study notes that the need to strengthen governance capacity in response to internal challenges within the youth community. In this regard, stakeholders should support the creation of learning spaces and investment in organizational development within youth communities through, for example, transfer of knowledge, experience, and good practices in community organizing. And stakeholders also need to support in the creation of learning spaces for organizational practices and policy making. Lastly, this study finds that freedom of expression and a safe environment for participation are still not comprehensively ensured by stakeholders. Youth civic action on climate and environmental issues, as we found in our study, tends to focus on less risky topics in order to ensure the protection of their civil rights to participate. Meanwhile, youth civic action on climate and environmental issues that are more, what we say, structural in nature, tend to be more limited due to concerns about threats to their civic rights. So in this regard, government and non-government stakeholders need to support the fulfillment of youth civic rights, including the freedom of expression and the creation of a safe environment for participation. Yeah, that's it from us. Thank you, and we look forward to our discussion in the Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Ryan and Widi, for a really comprehensive overview of strategies and support, I guess, that will be needed going forward, particularly around creating safe spaces and the promotion of those spaces. Thank you for the questions. I can see some coming through already. We're going to save those to the end. So we're just going to flow straight to our second speaker, Arya Fernandes, who is going to be talking to us, providing an overview of understanding patterns and trends of young voters. So Arya, over to you. Silakan.
Hi, everyone. So good morning for all of us, and thank you for having me here in this webinar. And I'm going to talk about young voters in Indonesian's politics, patterns and trend. And I have divided my presentation in 4 parts. First, I'd like to talk about the demographic characteristic of young voters and young politicians. Second, young voters' political participation. Third, young voters' perception on national leadership style that have already changed from populist leaders to so-called personal integrity leaders. And finally, conclusion and recommendation. So in the next slide, in the introduction next, as we know, Indonesia will held the simultaneous election, presidential and legislative election on February 14, 2024. And this will be one of the biggest election in the history, and where more than 190 million of voters will be participating in the election. And the 2024 election is the sixth democratic elections since the fall of Suharto's regime and the Reformation era in 1999. So one of the demographic changes in the upcoming election is that nearly 60% of the population are young voters from 17 years old to 39 years old. And so the understanding on how young voters' perception, behaviors, and attitude about leadership, performance, social and political issues, I think will shape the outcome of the election, of the upcoming election in February 14. So the next slide, I would discuss about, yes, next slide, please. Yes, I would discuss about who are young voters. And in this research, we categorize young voters from 17 to 80 to 39 years of age. And this definition was adopted from the Central Bureau of Statistics based on the result of 2020 national census that was conducted by BPS. The national census is conducted in every 10 years. And by the data, I tried to predict how many young voters will be in 2022. So according to election law, the registered voters is minimum 17 years old. And based on my projection, there are 54% of Indonesian young voters in 2022. And in the next 2 years, it will increase nearly to 60% of young voters and representing of 114 million of population. So in the next slide, to better understanding on how and why young voters, next slide, we at CSIS conducted a national representative survey in August from 8 to 13 August. Yes, next slide, please. And interviewed 1,000 and distributed proportionally in 34 provinces in Indonesia. And the sample also represented an equal gender representativeness and located in urban and rural areas. So the survey was conducted through the multi-stage random sampling with face-to-face interview. And using these samples, the margin of error of the survey is plus minus 2.84%, and with 95 level of confidence. So in this presentation, I also compare with our previous national survey that was conducted from 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2021. So and the survey cover some strategic issues such as political participation, political interest of young voters, democratic satisfaction, future issues of concern, and also social media use. Next slide. So to measure and compare young voters turnout in the election, we asked the respondents if they vote in the previous election or not. So if you see in the graph, based on the survey results, it showed an increase voters turnout from the 2014 election to 2019 election. It increased from 85.9% to 91.3% in the previous election. Next slide. Now, this graph, I think, tell us more about the level of political interest of young voters to be nominated as regional leaders in Pilkada or local election, and also running for the House of Representatives. And we also asked the respondent were the member of community or political parties or not. So in the left graph, the political interest of young voters to be nominated as political candidate is quite satisfying. As you see in the graph, around 15% of young voters are interested in running in the election, both running for regional leaders and also running for the House of Representatives. However, party membership among young voters remains low. It's only 1.1% of young voters registered as party members. And most of young voters, as you see in the graph, 21%, 21.6% members of youth organization. So in the next slide, I will discuss about the demographic of young politician. So because of nearly 60% of the voters are young voters, I think we should look at how many young politicians were elected in the DPR or national parliament. So I analyzed the profile of members of the DPR from 1999 to 2019, and I found that on average that only 15% of young politicians, it's mean 17 to 39 years old, were elected as MPs. So I think in the next election, with the high number of young voters, I reckon that parties should implement a political affirmative action or political quotas in nomination or in party structure to accommodate young politicians, because we have around 60% of the voters are young generation of the voters. So they will shape Indonesia's politics in the upcoming election. So next slide. In the next slide, the next slide, I will share about the trend of elected young politicians from 1999 to 2019. I divided two categories. The blue one is the percentage of elected young politicians age 17 to 39, and the orange is the elected of MPs above 40. So the result on average, as I mentioned earlier, the representative of young politicians remain low over the time. But in the 2009 in the legislative election, it peaked in 2009. And I assume that in the 2009 legislative election, political parties has adapted with the changing of democratic voters by nominating younger politicians. So in the next slide, I compare the data of young elected politicians from each political party in the DPR from the first election until the last election. And as you can see, the percentage of elected young politicians was high in the 3 elections. So, for example, PDIP participated in 1999 election for their first election after the Reformation era. In that election, they got around 9% of young politicians, SMPs, and increased to 17% in 2009. It's mean in this election. Also, as Golkar, the increased number of young elected politicians increased in the third election. I mean, also Gerindra and PKB from 27% to 35% in 2009 election. Also PAN, except PKS. So the PKS representative of young politicians were declining from election to election. Now it's only 5% of young elected politicians came from PKS. So the next slide. This is one of my on voters. So next slide. I compare democratic support of young voters from so all the data is based from national representative surveys that were conducted by CSIS, and we can see that the support for democracy among young generation fluctuated from 2016 to 2022, and I believe that political and economic performance matters in explaining democratic support of young voters. And when political stability were not maintained well, especially, for example, after the 2014 competitive election with Jokowi and Prabowo in the first election. So democratic, after 2 years in 2016, democratic satisfaction among young voters was only 53%, and it increased significantly where the government has consolidated his power and has performed well, and then from the peak 67 in 2019, and then drop and decrease in 2021, where the COVID pandemic has increased in number, and then increase again in 2022 above 60%.
Arya, just a couple of minutes.
To test
3 minutes, Arya.
what factors are okay. 3 minutes. Okay. So in the next slide, to test what factors are significant impact on younger satisfaction and democracy. I did logistic regression. So my dependent satisfaction and democracy, I use a dummy variable. So the question is, how satisfied are you with the quality of democracy currently? 1 for satisfied and 0 for unsatisfied. So I use two independent variable, political variable and economic variable. So political variable, government performance, civil liberties such as freedom of speech, trust in state institution, and optimism and combating corruption. So the economic variable. So the result is next slide. So it's also control variables, demographic, age group, gender, religion, and education. So we found that national economic conditions, freedom of speech, trust in president, and optimism in fighting against corruption are associated significantly with the satisfaction of young voters with democracy. So so if the economic perform well perform, and there are freedom of speech and also optimism in fighting against corruption, young voter will satisfied with democracy. And if the economic there is a problem on civil liberties such as criminal court law, and satisfaction with democracy, I think is declining. So the next slide, we also test, we list 10 of state institution, and then test, and we found that trust in president, police, and corruption eradication, or KPK, and commission, and electoral management body also have a positive and significant effect to support the satisfaction with democracy among young voters. So the trust on president, trust on KPK, and trust on KPU have again already a significant effect on satisfaction with democracy. So maintaining what KPK performance, and also police, I think will contribute to satisfaction with democracy. So the last slide, next, I share about the changing national leadership style among young voters. Next slide. Yes, this is the last slide.
This will have to be your last slide, Arya, sorry.
Yes, yes, last slide. So this is the last slide. So I compare two national best survey from 2019 national survey and 2022 national survey. And as you can see in the graph, for perception of national leadership month before election. So now it's changed from populist leaders to personal integrity leadership. So you see in the graph that the humility and populist leaders support decrease significantly from 40% to 15%. And the survey also found that a rise in voters' likelihood of an experienced and competent leader. So as you can see, honest integrity leaders increased significantly from 11% to 34% in 2022, and also increase in experienced and competent leaders. So I jump to conclusion.
We can have one more,
so
Arya,
I
we can have one more
think,
slide.
in the upcoming election, oh, we can have it. Okay. Next slide. So maybe I can jump to conclusion. So in the upcoming election, young voters matters in predicting the outcome of the election. And one of the biggest issues that concerned by the young voters is the economic issues. Also lead in time of crisis, innovative and creative policies, and also managing spend the COVID pandemic crisis of national leadership. And my second conclusion is social media use is also matters in predicting or explaining why do young voters vote for one parties and vote for the presidential candidate. And with the increased number in internet connectivity or misinformation also is the biggest challenges in our upcoming election. and I believe that we can promote, and also promoting young politicians is the other issues. We have nearly 60% of young population, young voters, but the representative of young politicians remains low. So I think the party should consider to nominate young politician, because of they have we already seen that young politicians have maintain with the good ideas and
Thanks so much, Arya, and thank you for persevering through our technology difficulties. There's a lot to unpack there. There's some really fascinating insights. I hope we could maybe come back to some of your slides and some of those insights that we weren't able to get to. But I'm going to hand over straight to Inaya Rakhmani to tell us a little bit more about her study on millennials in Jakarta. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the Australian National University Indonesia Institute for having Ariane, Utomo, and myself. So I'll be speaking on behalf of her throughout the presentation, and I hope I'm doing her justice. Ariane Utomo is a social demographer, and I had a social sciences, communication, and Asian studies training. And over the course of our section and research, we developed as well. And many of the way we gathered data was informed by the conversations that we had, both in professional settings and personal settings. And so both of us never separate our social identity with the way we ask questions and the way we treat our research subjects in the presentation that we will be giving you today. The research was carried out between 2018 to 2020. It was a survey on a sequential mixed method survey, research method. Part of it was a survey of 600 respondents in capital city Jakarta, which we theoreticize or conceptualize as millennials. So we looked into the literature on what millennial means to many of the scholars, having worked on the age cohorts. And we carried out interviews towards 60 in-depth interviews in between September to November 2020. So that was just when the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, we had to take that into account because it also highlights and magnifies the kinds of precarity, the kinds of uncertainty that this age cohort is facing in the labor market, the increasingly fluctuative and precarious labor market. It was funded by the Directorate of General of Higher Education, Republic of Indonesia. It was a multi-year research funding, and I am the principal investigator. Ariane on the first year was a collaborator, and over the course of deepening our relationship, she became co-PI, and we're still collaborating on around 3 other research together. So the kinds of young people or millennials that we speak of today is those born between 1981 until 1996. And we broke it right before the fall of the New Order, because that was a huge historical transition in Indonesia that contributed to the kinds of social milieus and social arenas that they are part of. We proportionately segmented our interviews based on their gender, their religion, their positionality, where they stay, which part of Jakarta that they stay in, and whether they migrated, whether they're second, first, third generation migrants, etc. So while we can't go too deep into these nuances, I would like to latch on to and meneruskan tendangan bola from Rian and Widi as well as Arya, because it struck me when Rian and Widi said adults are making the decisions for young people. I'm a late millennial myself, so I have a stake in this age cohort that is also a floating voter or social basis, as Arya explained. And my son is 14 years old, and he's part of the Zillennial generation that Angie spoke of at the beginning of our talk today. So when I speak of these age groups and try to bring into or mainstream the concerns into academic discussions, I'm saying it very much personally, grounded by academic reading and theorization. So when politicians, as Eve mentioned at the beginning of our session, are reminding us that these are the age groups that they need to appeal to, the young voters, and we problematize the definition of young because this definition has also been flagged by ministries of finances, economists, neoclassical economists, as those who will provide the demographic bonus for the country and would help Indonesia to bounce back after the pandemic. But at the same time, this demographic bonus, so this is this age cohort that is mentioned all over economic literature on Indonesia and Southeast Asia and the developing world, are people, young people, 25 to 40-year-olds who are promised in their education, throughout their education experience and socialization, that they can aspire to be a professional, whether in the banking sector, the education sector, medicine, engineering, etc., to have aspirations, modern aspirations for a future that is increasingly uncertain. And our data shows both quantitatively and qualitatively that these jobs are not able to be provided by the government. Neither any government around the world can make this promise to any young generations because contracts are increasingly casual, and especially so we in the academia and knowledge sector are also experiencing. So we think that we're on the same boat, that this generation of those 25 to 40-year-olds who are raising families, who are trying to figure out what kind of policymaker or what kind of politician we need to support, are living with increasingly precarious conditions in which there can't be any security in the future because the world keeps on changing so rapidly. And this milieu shapes the kinds of feelings, anxieties, as Widi and Rian mentioned, which relates to global neoliberal settings and social conditions that prime the relationship between these young voters with the politicians that they support. And the elite, the political elites, we have Anies Baswedan having been nominated by the National Democratic Party, and a day after that nomination, the party was called #Nasdrun, Kadal Gurun, or Desert Lizard. So Islamicizing the political party so that polarization is something to be expected in the upcoming elections. And this kinds of hashtags was also prevalent in the BTS army that Widi and Rian mentioned, because this BTS army, according to Ariane and I, were also in support of the hashtag Tolak Omnibus Law, cancel the Omnibus Law bill, because young people who have a stake in the kinds of legitimization of precarity that the law provides, legalizes, carried out demonstrations in large cities in Sumatra, Sulawesi, and also Java. So there are political moments in which communities of practices or fandoms, cosplay communities align in political interest, and even in a comparative way in which many of the army members were based in South Korea. And what's unique with this trend, if I may say so, is the fact that in my own work and other work of my colleagues like Ross Tapsell and his students are the ways the buzzer industry and influencers are mobilizing sentiments in favor of a certain political candidate. And because this BTS army has a very specific lingo, because it's a fan community, it's very difficult to mobilize because you can't mobilize them with bots. They know each other. They have this internal code switching that only being part of that community can know what they're talking about. You need digital ethnographic methods to understand. And if we pull back a bit before the Omnibus Law, because narratives of precarity and the future of work for this age cohort was also the social demographic of those participating in the 212 movement in 2016 and 2017. So together with my co-PI, teacher and friend, Fedi Hadis, we carried out a survey on 600 of the demonstrators of the 212 movement. So this is where what Angie mentioned at the beginning, rising conservatism plays into the kinds of anxieties and precarities that the millennials feel even before the omnibus law bill, because most of, or the majority of the demonstrators come from higher education, so it's high school and above. Most of them have assets, so they're not necessarily lower class or lower educated. They have, a majority of them, short contracts, so 1 to 2 years, and their parents or grandparents owned land, and with being increasingly urbanized, this land was let go due to gentrification in DKI Jakarta. So the kinds of precarity we argue in our article, Ariane and I, is that when you cannot latch on to the kinds of policy narratives, and if, as the criminal code, because I retweeted Eve last night, I got frustrated, as well as many of my colleagues and friends and those actually having their necks on the line. In this criminal code narrows the space for expression. So when you narrow the space for expression to channel your anxieties, channel your aggravations, channel your political leanings, there is a possibility based on data that other social bases, other social organizations would capture this floating mass, as we can see in the 212 movement, because the aggravations, the anxieties are actually about precarity, about the unfulfilled promises that modern education socialized to this floating social basis, floating social age cohort that was not realized by the kinds of jobs, the lack of meaningful jobs that this generation has or facing. So this is the social condition that we might expect in the upcoming elections. It's something that we've already been talking about in the past 5-7 years, but policymakers are very narrowly focused on economic growth, economic recuperation, economic recovery, and seeing the trees for the forests and the things that di depan mata, in front of their eyes, which is actually the age groups of their grandchildren and their children, are being ignored. So I very much agree with Widi and Rian's argument that there is a clear, based on evidence, and anxiety of the future towards climate change. There's also anxiety towards health infrastructure, the kinds of basic services that, in a rights perspective, it should be non-discriminatory. And that is in contrast with the kinds of political and religious mobilizations that the politicians and elite would be interested in the elections to come. Thank you for the time, Angie. I hope I haven't gone over. Back to you.
Oh, that was excellent. Thanks so much, Inaya. We're going to go open it up to questions now. So if you have a question, you could type it in the Q&A function. You can also raise your hand and I can flick to you. But we might just circle back to Arya's, and we'll kick off with Eve's question. I'm not sure if Eve is still here, if you want to ask it, Eve, or do you want me to?
I can ask it. I'm still here.
Oh, you're still here. There you are.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So yeah, Arya, thanks so much. You got some really interesting data there, and it's great how you can go back in time so far. But correct me if I'm wrong. You were just comparing. It was all data on youth, right? It wasn't youth compared to the general population. So I guess I just, first of all, I just want to confirm that, and second of all, can you give us a sense actually of how different young voters are to the rest of the population on these issues? Because, you know, it does sound very much like the sorts of things that matter to voters in general. And particularly when you're sort of talking about things that see sort of the correlation between what people care about and their level of satisfaction with democracy, things like the economy and general kind of governance issues. That does sound very much like the general population. So yeah, can you give us a little bit of a sense of whether you've done those sorts of comparisons? Thanks.
Arya, are you able to come back online?
Yes. Okay, thanks, Eve, for the question. So first, in the 2022 national survey we conducted in August, and we interviewed 1,192 samples provinces in Indonesia. So when I compare to the previous survey that were conducted also by CSIS from 2016, 2017, 19, and 2021, it a national population. So when I analyze the data, I filter the respondent, the sample between 17 years old to 39 years old. So because it's only in 2022 that all our sample is are young voters 17 to 39. So when I tried to compare either any comparison between young generation and general population, especially on democratic satisfaction, so or democratic support, and I found that there's no significant significant duration and all population. So but in terms of the issues and in terms of national leadership style, we found that there is significant differences. Young voters like what we call personal integrity leaders, and not corrupt leaders, and there is a significant decrease within populist leader to personal integrity leaders. So this is the interesting finding. So the second one is the issues, and as I mentioned earlier, the young voters they still perceive that the economic issues such as access to job, labor market, and the poverty rate, and also the new issues like environmental issues, health, and also democracy. Young generation, I think young voters attend to they believe that those issues the next president have to voice these issues in the upcoming election. So this is my answer. Back to you again, Angie. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Arya. We have a question here around, I guess, around organising and the types of organisations that have been around for a long time, such as the Pramuka. Valerie Hull is asking, what is the role of Pramuka in organising these types of civic activities? And are they interested in environmental issues? And perhaps to what extent that their mobilising capacity is able to be filtered and pushed towards these types of agendas. Have any of you got anything on the Pramuka and or any of these sort of older organisations that have been around for a long time? Their memberships, are they been decreasing over time? And what's their sorts of interest in these sorts of issues? Does anyone want to comment?
I think Mbak Inaya.
Yeah, I have my hand up. Well, my virtual hand
Oh,
here.
sorry, I didn't see it. Sorry.
That's fine. The Pramuka Karang Taruna, Ibu-Ibu PKK, and the other New Order state apparatuses that goes to a village level and kelurahan level are in competition with the kinds of more open organizations that came with decentralization programs. So World Bank programs, PNPM Mandiri, they have champions and kader desa or village cadres that also is at times in tension with or in collaboration with the old state apparatuses. So we can, if we want to really see on a granular level, we definitely need an anthropologist to answer the question. I can give insights regarding the fragmentation, proliferation, and that comes together with decentralization and democratization that goes down to the village level. And in some areas and provinces, they are also in tension or in collaboration with Pemuda Masjid, and this is very male-centric. At the same time, that usually Pemuda Masjid has also a female faction. And these are also the floating ummah that many scholars have mentioned, because with increasing individualization, due to urban life settings, it's very difficult to have meaningful, long-lasting bonds on a village level. So even if Karang Taruna in the state apparatuses exist, the individuals will switch between organizations because they socially migrate, borrowing Ririn's logic, spatially, physically, and also digitally. So it's very difficult to capture and nurture across organizations. So I hope that gives a broad overview about the role of Pramuka or other old New Order infrastructures. Thank you. Over to you, Angie.
Thank you. And I know in places such as, East Indonesia, but also places where organizations had been shut down through perceived or real affiliations with PKI, for example, and the possibilities for the revival of some of these, particularly Karang Taruna, have been able to actually fill that space at a village level, particularly through Eastern Indonesia. I've seen that these organizations have been able to use these old structures and to use these old modes, but have previously, have not been allowed to kumpul at all, but have been able to quite successfully use these structures to be able to form and organize and to have actual voice within that village structure. So I guess, there's a range of strategies, right? And there's a range of ways that people can maneuver. Inaya, there's no one that's got questions coming through. Inaya, I would love to hear a little bit more about what you and Dr. Utomo are finding in your study around precarity and how people are negotiating those religious norms and increasing conservatism in their working life. Would you be able to share with us a little bit more on that?
I'll try. I'm now rereading the data. So hopefully I have my space there. It's the end of the year, so everyone is doing admin, signing off things. So across the research subjects that we talk to, religion is used or is useful in a more individual and privatized settings. So in the global north, although this is also very heterogeneous, there is policies in place for the increasingly precarious millennials to have the space to take care of their mental well-being because of the kinds of disruptions that COVID introduced to this labor to the labor market and those working within it. So the policies are more centered in some of these welfare states on the subjective well-being and the kinds of corridors for therapy, and to make sense of the increasingly uncertain world they live in. In countries where religious socialization is deep and long-lasting, among them Indonesia, religious leanings or religious practices provide what the state government cannot provide in terms of therapy, psychotherapy, and well-being, and measuring well-being that against the labor productivity. And within, so narrowing down again, within the dominant or majority Muslim organizations like NU and Muhammadiyah, the young people there who are part of the organization's aristocratic lines have a clear career path within the organizations. However, those who are not, who came from rural areas, who were urbanized during their formative years, are increasingly part of the floating ummah towards whom conservative Islamic norms appeal. And the subjects that we interviewed are quite but they are, precarity is internalized in their everyday life. So when they have religious leanings, whether they are spiritually Islamic or they had Muhammadiyah parents, they use it in a private setting like the precarious millennials in Australia would. Pray in their rooms. It's similar to meditating. So I'm not drawing parallels apple to apple. I'm explaining the historical specificity in which precarity is felt and expressed in particular ways, but it's primarily grounded in lack of security. And one of the respondents said, but this is one of the quotes, the paraphrase quotes that I think represents their aspirations well. Praying provides soothing methods for me to wake up in the morning and also to go from job to job. And I'm grateful. So rasa syukur is also helpful in this. I'm grateful that I still have a job. So even though I have to work online and mobilize people online, but rezeki itu harus disyukuri. So that narrative, fortune needs to be responded with gratefulness. So this is a narrative of acceptance, spiritual acceptance that's prevalent in other religious doctrines. So across our subjects, this is what we found, and we need to note that their demography is millennials in DKI Jakarta. So they are urbanized and they are familiar with secular public settings. So they're very different from the social demography of the subjects that we surveyed in 2017, part of B212 or Aksi Bela Islam movement. Hope that answers your question, Angie.
Yeah, no, that's really, really fascinating, the differences and that level of acceptance of this is the situation, but it just compounds, right, the situation. So I guess that leads me to perhaps our final question, and this is for each of you, for the panel. Where to from here? You've all indicated around, young people's, while there is an acceptance of this sort of precarity and this sort of uncertainty, their coping mechanisms around this is very individualized. At the same time, as Arya's work has shown, young people really, really value these aspects of democracy, freedom of expression, the ability to assemble. So where to from here? What do we do? How do we support young people? Where are the entry points for young people themselves to be able to be responding. None of this is new, right? The criminal code is just an intensification of what has been happening now for many years. So where are young people to go now, and what sort of supports are available to them, and what sorts of new sorts of structures are needed? Over to you, panel.
So let me try first. Okay.
Mas Arya.
Angie. So first, I think voicing the need of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, or maintaining freedom of speech and expression, is the best way to maintain millennial support to democracy, and also millennial support satisfaction with democracy. So second one is if the government or the MPs, yes, we still the transition is 3 years. So but if the increased fearness, it will be affected on democratic satisfaction. So I mean, I think that maybe 2 weeks in the next month, maybe I think there will be a political mobilization from young voters to refuse or to criticize the new or the updated new criminal code, or the government has said, if you do not agree with the criminal law, you can submit to constitutional court. So let's see what will happen in the next month regarding the criminal court law. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Arya. And yeah, we all know to submit an application to the Constitutional Court isn't easy. It's time consuming, it's labor intensive, it's expensive, and they're rarely successful. But I guess, you know, they're left with little choice, which seems to me, you know, the public and in the realm of public discourse is where pressure has to come from. Widi and Ryan, do you have any thoughts around, you know, what's to come and opportunities for young people and different types of organising, perhaps?
Okay, who's gonna go first, Widi? Or...
I can go first. Okay.
Sure.
Yes. So I think, yeah. Again, I think that what Rian touched at the end of our presentation, actually, I think it's really a really difficult time for us all in terms of, you know, our freedom of expression. But I think, yeah, continuing what Mas Arya has said before, even though it's not easy, as you said, Angie, but 3 years we still can do something, and we have to kind of maintain that little bit of optimism, maybe. And also, like, in terms of the youth from our study as well, I think a lot of room around mentorship, around roles to make the youth, it's not necessarily just skills, but also the wisdom that we can need to pass to them, how we can manage this difficult situation, and how we can, you know, always think clearly ahead. I think it needs all of us to also think about and work on that. I think that's from me. And Rian.
Yeah, in terms of the fulfillment of civic rights, I remember that our study actually records several experiences of youth activists who experienced, for example, hacking, doxing, and intimidation during demonstration or protests. Also the lack of support from parents, from teachers and the community where they live. That made many young people actually feel hesitant to get involved in any kinds of protests, including in a peaceful form. Several informants from our study also conveyed the need for legal protection for young activists specialized for them, including for children when carrying out or participating in demonstration. And given the recently approved criminal code, I think this is also a good opportunity for young people to be involved in future advocacy efforts in regards to the trifecta reform, as we call it in PUSKAPA, namely the criminal code, the ITE law, and also the KUHAP, the criminal procedural law, that actually hinders all the rights of civic spaces and civil rights. So I think it's a good opportunity for them to be more involved in a more planned or systematic manner, also by ensuring their safety. And from the study, we see that there is so much that young people can do. For example, like the strategy of public mobilization in a lot of creative ways, which is, I think, lacking from non-youth movement organizing.
Thanks, Ryan. And last word to you, Anaya. Optimism, glass half full, half empty? How do you see things going forward?
I think the other panelists said it well. So realistically, I think we would, our social conditions, whether in Australia or Indonesia, won't change much for this generation. I think we will continually repeat the paradox that the previous age cohort will make the decisions for the next age cohort. So adults making the decision for young people who would be aggravated towards the conditions that were shaped outside of their power. But if I can be hopeful, this cycle can be broken if we have what Widi says, clarity of mind. And that's our job in the academia. That's our job in the research sector, to say things as they are, however difficult it is, and band together with those who are experiencing fundamentally similar social conditions and find common ground so that we are better organized against those structures, because in different ways we're all subject to them. So hopeful, still some remaining hope, but also very realistic. Thanks, Angie.
Yeah, 100%. It's around solidarity, and I want to give my solidarity to all of you in Indonesia. Thank you for all of the work you do. It's going to be even more crucial in the next couple of years. So thank you so much, and thank you for giving your time to us today. It was really enlightening. I could listen to each of you for many, many hours. So perhaps we should reconvene at some point and see how this is all playing out. But thank you again, each and every one of you. Thank you also to the Indonesia Institute. And we're going to sign out here. So terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih.
Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much.